So the session today is presented by Fidelity Factory. We're going to move on to our discussion around Power Platform environments. Thankfully, we have Rem Saparco here today. He's done all kinds of work providing strategic guidance to organizations that leverage environments, and he's going to help with some of the points that we'll be discussing today. But really want to provide you with an intro to environments and then talk about strategy. How your organization can leverage environments and really why you should invest in a strategy with environments. So we'll get started with our introduction next. So we have a little bit of a who, what, when, where, why. We start this slide deck off with. And here's the first question that we're going to be answering. Power Platform environments, what are they? So every app or automation that you create has to be deployed into an environment. It needs a home to live in. And environments do provide us with that capability. They also provide us with a very strong security boundary. So if you want to protect information, isolate apps and automations, you can leverage environments to do that with. They're also a very useful tool for application lifecycle management. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about strategy. But if you are practicing enterprise grade deployments and other aspects of ALM, you want to consider how environments factor into that. Environments also provide trial capabilities. So it's a great place to check out features, or maybe your developers need somewhere to try some things that you don't want to just deploy into another environment. You can create trial areas to do this with, or trial environments to do this with. Another key point and fact about environments is that every environment is linked to a region. So you can have a regional Power Platform deployment. You leverage environments in different data centers of Microsoft in these different regions so that you can deploy apps in the locale or the geography that your users actually reside within. All right, moving along. Who can create an environment? I think the big thing to watch here is potentially anyone can. This is something that we always are talking to our customers about, and you know, it's really important to call this out. There are settings in the admin center where you can identify who actually has this capability, and there's a few levels here. So you can see from the settings screen, we've got everyone being able to create environments, production environments even, and then we have the same setting for trial environments. So you want to dial in and control this. You don't want just anyone being able to create and deploy environments, especially production and sandbox environments. You're going to end up with a sprawling situation and a whole lot of governance, management, administration concerns. So it's a really important thing to check on your tenant, how this has been set up. Where do environments live? So all your environments live under your Azure Active Directory tenant, and more specifically an environment, as we mentioned previously, it does get deployed into a Microsoft data center tied into a specific region. So you'll be able to choose the region when you get into the point of creating an environment. You're asked where you would like this environment to reside, which data center it will be deployed into via the region that you choose. Rem, you want to take this one on the 5 layers of security?
From an environment perspective, it comes with database and also some, user capabilities. So from a security perspective, top level security, you have to always have Azure Active Directory access. So it means you need an Active Directory account. And then you have your environment access. So each environment outside of the default environment can be locked down in terms of access. And then at the application level, you can define who has access to that application automation. And then you have security roles within that Dataverse that you can apply. And then cross-tenant connectors as well, or restrictions for connectors as well that you can leverage. So 5 layers of security there.
How many trial environments can we configure?
Yeah, so trial environments don't go up against your capacity. So really you can create as many as you like, just keeping in mind that they expire after 30 days and get deleted. You have an opportunity to extend it, but you can only extend it by so many times.
Rem, after a trial environment has expired, it's automatically deleted. You do have the ability to restore it. And then you could potentially use like a sandbox environment to restore it into another area if you wanted to move it towards production, right?
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about a few reasons or use cases for environments. Why would someone create an environment? So one of the common ones that we see is that it provides a very secure place that you can run special apps and automations within. For example, if your HR, your finance team is building some apps and automations that are leveraging data that it may relate to personnel or the organization's finances. You may want to create a dedicated environment to isolate all these apps within. It's going to give you a really good security wall that you can leverage to control who's actually accessing or may potentially even administer content within the environment.
Another reason for creating environments is, again, trying to enforce that ALM, developing, like putting together a development environment, test environment, and production environment. Nice thing about this as well is if you actually enable Center of Excellence Starter Kit, you have that capability of automating deployments between dev to test and then test to production.
So Jeffrey just commented in the chat that he created a development environment for himself. And this is a really great use case for environments as well. You may have your dev test prod path that you've defined the 3 different environments for, but there may be cases where the developer is just spiking something out. You may want to provide them with their own dedicated development environment, and that's an option for you to leverage. There is a developer plan. Jeffrey just posted that to the chat as well. So this is actually a separate type of environment, a developer environment that can be leveraged there. So there's more details provided by Jeffrey in the chat. Please.
Yeah, so Sean mentioned this earlier in terms of deploying your environments to specific regions. So we just finished a fairly large implementation, Center of Excellence implementation with a well-known global company. So they have basically locations in the US, all of South America, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and EMEA. So we were trying to just determine how that environment or strategy is going to work. So we have people in Australia that's really active within the Power Platform, so it warranted having a specific environment for Australia. By doing that and setting aside that geographic region for those folks in Australia, they're actually able to access that application quite a bit faster, just because of that internet connection, doesn't have to cross the transatlantic pipe, and having everything kind of done within North America. So geographic region and regionalizing your environments may become necessary if you have a global footprint.
So the next one here is allowing trial functionality. So we've been talking about trial environments, and I think this really just, this point's pretty well already been covered for us. The last one here that we have is to support backup and restore operations. So you can leverage sandbox environments for some of these administrative activities. And then actually within the platform itself, you do have the admin center itself, you do have a whole lot of capabilities for working with environments. If you need to back up, restore, and do all those kinds of operations, they're there. And you can leverage sandboxes, or in some cases, I believe you can even restore over a production environment, but you need to be careful with some of those features and capabilities. Rem, any other use cases that you'd like to talk about with regards to reasons for creating environments?
The security one is one that gets overlooked every once in a while. So when you're creating your data loss prevention policies and you have a specific policy in mind, it's better to segregate an environment for that specific policy just to keep things secure. And again, just enforcing the rules that you want to implement. And then anybody that kind of fits that role will be relegated to that environment just to make sure that they're abiding by the rules and governance that you've set aside.
So this is the official list of environments that we'll talk about. One that should be added here is, as Jeffrey mentioned, the developer environment, I believe, shows up as a totally separate category in the Power Platform Admin Center as well. But the default environment is one that gets deployed into every tenant. And this is basically the environment that Microsoft stands up your Power Platform with. And it does come with a few extra considerations as well. By default, everyone is a maker in that environment. And, so this may provide some additional concern that you want to put into your data loss prevention, for example, or other aspects of what may be happening there. So your governance and administration in the default environment may take some extra care and attention. We often recommend that folks use the default environment as a sandbox area for people just to try out the platform and maybe for personal productivity solutions. And then you kind of have a totally separate dev test prod path using production environments, which is next on the list.
So things to keep in mind when you're looking at the different environment types. So obviously a default environment, you don't have a lot of control in terms of securing it or maybe even customizing it. Whereas anything that you create, like production, sandbox, trial, and so on, you have that capability to secure it better and to actually make some adjustments there as well. For example, from a trial environment, that expiration date that you can extend And we'll talk a little bit about the sandbox and development environment best practices a little bit later, but there's some certain things that you can do there. So the key point with a default environment, you can't delete it. Okay? Again, you're very limited in terms of what you can or can't do in that default environment.
Yeah, the Dataverse for Teams is the last one on the list as well. And with the integration Microsoft has offered with the Power Platform for Teams and the Dataverse for Teams, this also is a separate type of environment that gets deployed. And you do have a Dataverse instance that's created automatically with the Dataverse for Teams or for these types of environments. So that's something to consider. But I don't believe the capacity with these goes up against your licensed capacity. I think it's handled separately, but that's another type of environment that you'll see out there. So if folks are using Power Apps app in Teams and they're building solutions there, or the Power Automate app in Teams, you're going to see these Dataverse for Teams environments popping up in your Power Platform Admin Center.
So every time you create an environment, you're going to chew up 1 gig of capacity space that's available for you. So by default, you're going to get at least the default environment. If you don't purchase any licenses, for example, if you don't purchase any Power App per user plan, you're relegated to just that default environment. So you will need at least 1 Power App per user plan to be able to create other environments. Okay. You can also buy capacity via premium licensing or procure capacity on its own. So when you go to the Microsoft licensing page in Azure or in your Office 365 portal, you can get capacity from there as well. Okay, so really important. That's why having a strategy is really important to be able to plan out your capacity and how many environments you can actually create.
So all your capacity gets used up along the way by the Dataverse database files and log data that's tracked as people are transacting with your environment. And the final bullet point really just speaks to the idea around every environment optionally may contain a Dataverse instance. So you don't have to deploy a Dataverse instance into an environment, but we're seeing more and more use and uptake of the Dataverse just because it really is a great enterprise data store, and there's a number of other benefits we can talk about perhaps at the end if you're interested in hearing more about that. Data loss prevention is a really important aspect of the platform itself, and also is related heavily to environments. And with data loss prevention, or DLP as it's commonly referred to, you have the ability to define rules around what happens with the connectors, and you can apply these rules in one environment or all environments, or you can exclude environments that you apply the rule to. So there's a number of different ways of defining the scope for these data loss prevention rules. And you have the ability to choose from the almost 500 connectors that are out there to connect to services and data sources that are out there. And you can pick and choose which of those you would like to classify as either business or non-business, or you can block them outright. So you get to go through and build these rules, decide which environments they'll apply to, and then it's going to stop bad things from happening with your data if you deploy these correctly. So, for example, you may never want to mix the Facebook connector with the SQL Server connector, your enterprise data. So you can decide which of these you want to allow people to mix and match on an environment by environment basis. And this provides you with a really strong way of deciding what happens with your data or controlling that. So it's a good example of putting up the guardrails for people, which is kind of a term that's often used to help guide your citizen developers in the right direction, right? So you don't want them doing things with data that you would rather them not. This is a really easy way of taking care of that.
Understanding your data loss prevention strategy is really, really important when you're considering environments and environment strategy. They go hand in hand. So you really have to understand how you're going to approach data loss prevention and what connectors you're going to allow before you can really formulate a strong environment strategy.
So let's talk a little bit more about Power Platform strategy now and do a bit of a focus on that. So what should a good environment strategy include? These are a few of the things that Rem and I thought were really important. Starting off, you need to have a really strong vision for the platform, and having the vision and making sure that the leaders within the organization have bought into that vision and can help propagate it through the different business units is extremely important for the success of the vision and the actual execution of it. So this is going to help roll into an effective strategy. Rem, anything else you want to mention there specifically?
Yeah, when you're considering vision, also consider like what are your thoughts on citizen developers? So we have a number of clients with varying strategies in terms of citizen developers, where we have some clients that just don't believe in it and everything should be done within the ITIS and vendor realm. And then we have some major organizations that basically bought like 30,000 licenses for the Power Platform and just distributed it to all their employees. So there's different philosophies on citizen development. So having that understanding on how you're going to deploy the Power Platform has a huge impact in your environment strategy. Oddly enough, it's the larger companies that are embracing citizen developers, and it's the smaller companies that are kind of reluctant to hand the Power Platform off to the citizen developer.
One of the services that we offer is called the COE framework, and we help organizations with this whole process of defining a strategy, and with defining a vision. We always look at the roles that are going to be interacting with the platform, and that's a really big part of having a successful strategy. Is first of all knowing the roles that you want to enable, understanding how you're going to enable them, and how you plan to strategically leverage them so that your vision is going to come to life. So these are all important parts of building out your strategy. The next bullet point is making sure you understand the intended use cases for the platform. So it's obvious that you've got all these great solution building capabilities with the platform. Where do you see this being leveraged most effectively in your organization? Are there some standout opportunities that you see? Are there types of things you would rather not engage right away with the platform? Maybe you're not ready to be building mobile apps, or you don't want to start out with RPA. How are you going to leverage the technology strategically so you ensure success as you go, rather than going live with everything at once and potentially running into problems or issues along the way? Rem, anything else that you can think of around that use case idea?
No, I think you got it good there. That was good. Actually, the more important things for me is really in and around the Dataverse and how you're going to use it. Having a strategy around Dataverse is really critical. I think we're going to get into more details on kind of what the impact of the Dataverse has on your environment strategy, but it is really quite important in terms of that storage capacity, and then how it's going to be leveraged within different organizational or business units within your company. From a roadmap perspective, just understanding where you are with your short-term goals, and from a Power Platform perspective, like maybe you just want to do Canada for now and see how that works out. So taking that modular approach to the Power Platform to see if it's the right fit for your organization, having kind of a milestone and gated approach to your deployment. This is a good strategy, and will help you as well in terms of how you're going to deploy your environments. So having that short-term goal and then midterm goal of where you're going to be with the Power Platform, and ensuring and then double checking to make sure that, hey, this is what we set out to do, this is what we've done, and kind of start marking yourself in terms of have you accomplished what you set out to do.
Be aware that environments linked to D365, CE Finance, and operations, et cetera, can go to just a single environment. So if you have dev test CRP environments, you might need additional environments to support testing the integrations and apps that you've deployed. Let's talk a little bit about the costs of not having a strategy. So these are problems that will appear. Some of you may have encountered parts of these if on your journey, perhaps with the platform. But sprawl is a big one that we see with many platforms. It's not something that's specific to the Power Platform. There's many tools out there that experience this issue where you put something into the hands of users that they can propagate, and they're going to do what they can to get the job done, and they're not going to be worried about the ownership, the cost of ownership perhaps, and the management and administration that they're going to be the weight they'll add as they deploy more and more. So making sure that you avoid that environment sprawl by controlling who can create environments is a really important thing to do, and it's going to save you that problem down the road.
Yeah, so opposite of that is being too tightly controlling on your environment and not having enough. The problem with that is you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of apps sitting in that environment, and trying to find the app that you're looking for could be extremely difficult.
Having the lack of control is going to come hand in hand with kind of the last problem we talked about. You're not going to be able to manage effectively if you don't have a strong environment strategy. You're not going to be able to know where to look for issues. Even using a tool like the COE framework, for example, you're going to have more problems with that just because you're not going to have a strong way of you haven't organized things. You're not going to even know where to look to find something that you're trying to manage and administer.
Yeah, potential loss and misuse of data. Again, just not having that strategy means that you probably haven't worked out security. So on the opposite side of that potential loss and misuse is that, people that actually need access to that data or that application won't have access because they don't have access to the environment. So this leads to the next bullet point, which is that higher cost of ownership, because now you're going to have to do more support just to get the right permissions in place, getting support calls saying, hey, I have access to this app, but I don't know where it is, and things like that, or even access to data. So I have access to the app, I don't have access to the data. So more support calls in terms of supporting some of these applications because of lack of having an environment strategy.
And then we get into some concerns around data. And specifically, misuse of the common data model, for example. So if you're using the Dataverse and you've deployed a common data model in your organization, I think the example, Rem, that you gave was around something as simple as contacts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you have multiple business units or organizational units sharing the same environment and it's using the common data model. So one business unit is using the accounts and contacts for vendors and vendor management and vendor contacts. And the other one is using that contacts for something else, or maybe perhaps a customer. And then now you've got that kind of data mixed in together, and then they want to go ahead and customize or even add more fields to that common data model for accounts. And when they go try to deploy, you get kind of all that confusion just because that common data model isn't so common, because it's a mix of different business units trying to use accounts for various reasons.
Yeah. This could just lead to other issues as well. I mean, potentially the overwriting of data. If you don't have a well-defined strategy for the data, you can imagine that maybe problems similar to the ones Rem's described, where you have business unit conflicts that are both trying to leverage the same tables in the Dataverse. You could have some issues there. Solution dependencies. So if you have competing solutions that are leveraging similar pieces of the Dataverse, tables or choices, maybe they're going to run into conflicts down the road when you go to deploy something. It could become very problematic. And then, the last point I think we've pretty well covered off. Rem, anything else you can think of with regards to the Dataverse and how your environment strategy could be affected there?
Well, it's really the key thing is just sometimes you need that isolation of the Dataverse to be able to do a proper solution. Especially mission critical applications, you don't want that mixing in with standard business applications that maybe aren't so critical in using the Dataverse.
So let's talk about some of the benefits of having a good strategy. So the first one, I think we've definitely had a bit of a prelude to with some of the points we've already talked about, but just having that strong strategy with your environments and a well-structured and well-organized Power Platform deployment, it's going to make it much easier for people to interact with, both for users as well as administrators and owners. So you're going to have a more predictable platform, and you're going to get results more consistently, more consistently. You're going to get those expected results out of the platform that you're looking for.
Yeah, and just being able to secure it and it's safe. Being able to apply that data loss prevention policy properly and knowing what environment it's going into. And then from a Dataverse perspective, just being able to secure the right tables for the right roles so that they make sense for the business users and the business units, where it makes more sense for them. Gives you just a much richer experience with those solutions.
Yeah. There's also automation. Go ahead. You take that one.
I'll take that one. The automation potential. This is where I get excited about, because this is some of the work that we were doing with that global company for a few months. Again, just if you have a really good environment strategy and you've created processes around your application lifecycle management, you've created processes around how you enable your citizen developers, automating the environment creation all the way up to enabling a citizen developer where a license gets issued, they get access to the environment. All of those steps can actually be automated with the tools within the Power Platform. So you have automated deployments even from a developer perspective, knowing just this is the cycle that we go through here. There are environments that are really prescribed. So we go from dev, test to production quite easily. So the other key thing to note here, from a development perspective, there are development best practices in terms of the environments as well. So some environments or some developers require an isolated environment for their development because this is going to be a mission critical application that's going to need its own Dataverse. So how do you manage that so that you create a development environment for each of these applications? And so imagine being a global company, you could have, if not thousands of these types of environments. So the key approach here is to be able to dynamically create these development environments and put an expiration date on them. So that we know the project's going to last this long. You still have a mechanism for extending that, the expiration of that, but you should create a business process or a workflow to tell you, create the development environment for this solution. Once it goes into testing and everything's good, then that development environment should be discarded or deleted. That helps you maintain that environment count. And
I think the PowerCat team, I believe I mentioned maybe in the very last meetup, they released a Power Platform maturity model, and a lot of these enterprise concepts that Rem are highlighted there. But that whole application lifecycle management capability and the pairing with environments is, a real great benefit to organizations that want to get to the next level there. Improve user adoption. So Rem was talking earlier about, the downside of having one environment with absolutely every app or automation within it. It's not going to be very usable. People are going to have a hard time finding the apps and automations that they want to actually use. You put some thought into creating environments. It's going to improve the experience of users. Things are going to be more well organized. They're going to have an easier time finding the things they're looking for, and then you get all the added benefits of the items that we've already talked about in this slide. Rem, anything else you want to mention here?
So we talked a lot about the environment strategy, but the environment strategy is just really the first step towards establishing your center of excellence. So yes, this is a good first step, but really, you really should be thinking about that overall center of excellence experience with the Power Platform.
So this slide highlights a few typical patterns that you'll see out there, and some of these I think we've already talked about. So here's the very first one, is the one that perhaps Jeffrey was highlighting earlier. So, well, sorry, my bad. That's the default environment, not the one Jeffrey was talking about. The default environment is one Rem said gets deployed by Microsoft, and you can't even delete it. So you need to figure out how you want to leverage that default environment. And we always, as I said, recommend that it's used as a sandbox. The developer environment is the next option. So you may have a use case where you want to deploy an environment for a specific developer. You want them to try some things out there and to be able to use that to kind of have a development sandbox that's separate from the default environment, which could get more cluttered, right? You give them a clean space to work in to kick off their work. And next we move into this pattern here. So you may have a critical project that you're working on, and you don't want to put it into your typical dev test prod. You'd like to isolate it. So you can use this yellow path that we have here to enable that. You could create a separate dev test prod for a critical project and have a dedicated area to deploy that into, and eventually it would go into its own prod environment, and therefore it would reside. So this is another pattern that you can use. Next, we have kind of the typical gold standard dev test prod environment that enterprises often deploy.
So in this scenario, it's typical that when you have a shared test and a shared prod environment between multiple business units, that there's typically no Dataverse involved at this point, where it's just a really simple environment where they're using SharePoint as a backend. Dataverse is strictly used from an approval perspective, because you do need Dataverse to do approvals, because that's where that approval data is maintained, but there's no custom tables created in this scenario. So it's a lot easier to share that environment. There's really not too many moving parts from that perspective.
And the last point here we see is really a scenario where you might have a dedicated environment for an important project that would funnel back into the gold standard dev test prod path. So that's kind of another use case that you may deploy in your environments. Rem, what do you think? Is there anything else that you want to talk about with regards to other patterns that you've seen?
Yeah, so typical pattern. So when we get especially for larger companies, we get kind of how do we deal with Dataverse and being able to share that information. So really, when we start looking at Dataverse, we start looking at those business units. We look at can they share the Dataverse as that one business unit? And if that's the case, then we'll create an environment set. And I mean by environment set, I mean dev, test, and prod specific for that business unit. So that way they can share that. That way we can kind of avoid that environment sprawl, because now that business unit can share all those three environments without us having to create multiple environments just for different applications for that specific business unit. So that's where sharing would typically make sense when there's Dataverse involved. When the common data model makes sense, then that's when you can share that environment for that business unit or multiple business units if they can share that common data model. So that's kind of one of the precursors for having that shared environment.
Oh, I wonder if do logic apps end up in environment? Logic apps are environment independent, right? Because they're running as an Azure service. So I don't believe those end up in a Power Platform environment. But that's something we could double check. But I really do believe those are kind of handled independently.
Yeah, that was my question. Since we have dedicated logic apps, which are very much like Flow, Flow end up in an environment. I was wondering if the logic apps actually ended up in an environment.
Yeah, I think those reside separately from flows. Ryan's got a question here. Could you talk a little bit more about licensing requirements to have multiple environments? One of the biggest considerations to make around environments and as you're building your strategy. So Rem and I both mentioned a little bit about the capacity requirements along the way. You are going to be consuming capacity as you add data, apps, and automations, logging information into these environments. That capacity is going to grow. And you're going to need to have additional capacity, likely over and above anything that you're going to get by default for an active Power Platform deployment. And there's a few different options around how you can obtain that additional capacity. Rem, are you going to bring up the licensing guide to highlight some of those options for?
Actually, I'm going to talk about capacity, like what you can see in the admin dashboard.
Oh, okay.
So you can see here. Hopefully you can see my screen. So original tenant, so for each license you get, you're going to get some capacity. So right now our total is 25. So every time you create an environment, you use up a gig. So for every license that you buy, you're going to get some entitlements. So right now we've got 15. And then that's for the database, and you get allocations for file as well and for logs. Okay. So from the file, that's your Dataverse. And then you can purchase more for that as well. And you're going to get a warning at 15%, 10%, and at 5%. So that's how that all comes together. So every time you buy a license, and I was trying to get to the pricing page and trying to get to where that extra capacity was going to come in. So you do get 50 MB capacity, database capacity on the per app plan. On the per user plan, you get 250 MB database capacity, and then 2 gigs file capacity for these licenses.
So definitely there's some consideration to put into how you're going to be leveraging that licensing and the capacity associated with it as you work through your deployment plans.
So Jeffrey, the default isn't 10 gig. It is for us. We just have a different licensing model than other organizations. So ours isn't going to show up a little bit.
Yeah, if you're leveraging D365,
Yeah.
you may get that 10 gig. Any other questions, folks?
Is there a way to add capacity just by purchasing storage space without licensing?
Yeah, you could buy additional capacity.
Okay, so I can contact my VAR and there's a SKU for capacity. Okay.
There is. Hey, Don, you could just speak.
Thanks, guys. This is great. Really appreciated it.
Okay.
You're very welcome, Danya. Thanks for coming.
No problem.
Yeah, we really appreciate everyone coming today. Those are some great questions that you had. We're glad to share all this information with you. If there's any content you're interested in seeing in the future, folks, reach out to us either in the meetup or email us at contact@fidelityfactory.com. We'd love to hear from you. But I think that pretty much covers it for today, folks. Rem and I are going to sign off here, and thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing you at the next session. Have a good one, folks.
Thanks, guys.